Hi, everybody. What's up? You're watching Sit Down. I'm DJ Sixsmith. Brand new book right here. It is called The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Could Do It Again. Robert Putnam, Shaylyn Romney Garrett. How are you both doing today?
Terrific.
Great. Happy to be with you.
It's really nice to have both of you on. Bob, why don't we start with you? You're somebody who has studied political science for a long time. You've written many books. I read a little bit of Bowling Alone, I was telling you before. What was it like jumping into this project, and why write a book like this now?
Well, Shaylyn and I have been working together for many years, actually. We're obviously, and I think it's obvious, she's a lot younger than me. Shaylyn was originally a student of mine about, 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And we've been close ever since. We are both interested in how America got into a pickle. We're in a real pickle at the moment. And probably every viewer, no matter what their political views, thinks it doesn't get any worse than this. America is in a real crisis. And Shaylyn and I were interested not only in how we got there, but what we could do to get out of there. And so from our point of view, and I think this is not controversial, actually, in a time in which everything else is controversial, America has hardly been in worse shape than we are now. And we are more polarized politically than we have almost ever been. We're more unequal economically, actually, than we have almost ever been. We're more socially fragmented almost than we have almost ever been. And we're also more focused on ourselves, more inward focuses rather than on community, more than we ever been before. And if you follow that, and most accounts that you hear nowadays about our plight begin over the last 30 or 40 years, and they describe how we got to this stage. And they end up with a very pessimistic outlook on what's been happening in America. We have a somewhat different take because we go back not just 50 or 60 years, but 125 years. And what we find 125 years ago, it was called the Gilded Age, and it was a period of extreme inequality, extreme political polarization, extreme social fragmentation, and extreme self-centeredness. And if that sounds a little familiar, it is familiar. And what we describe is, beginning 125 years ago to now, a big U-shaped curve in which we started off very focused on the I, and over the first 60 or 70 years after that, up until the 1970s about, we have become more of a we, more equal, more connected, less polarized. And then over the last 60 or 70 years, this is the part of the story everybody else notices, we've been getting worse. But if you begin back at that earlier period, I think, Shaylyn, don't we agree that back there, it's a much more optimistic outlook. It leads you to hope and not to despair. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really important to have some hope. And Shaylyn, I'll bring you in here. I think it's really fascinating, everything that Bob just mentioned, and also how you both just zoom out for 125 years here. So what was most fascinating to you as you start digging through everything here?
You know, I've been an enthusiast of the progressive era for a long time. And the progressive era is the era that came on the heels of the Gilded Age, right? So it was really the progressive era in which we saw a very concerned group of reformers grab the reins of American history and say, we're not going to be in this mess any longer. We are going to right the ship, and we're going to pull up out of this upswing. And I don't know if they even really knew it at the time, but with the benefit of this 125-year lens, we really see the way in which they engineered a vast, multifaceted, very clear upswing in our nation's history that lasted really 2/3 of a century. And so for me, the question is, how do we look to their example, and what do we learn from them that we might be able to apply today? Now, of course, some of the issues that they were dealing with were different back then. A lot of them were really similar, though, actually. And so we know things are going to look a bit different, but are there broad lessons that we can learn from the progressive era and apply today? And, maybe I could just touch on a few of those lessons. So the first, I think that is fascinating to me is that the progressives were engaged in a very clear project of moral awakening. They were not just saying, hey, inequality is a bad thing for everyone because it's bad for our economy. They were saying, inequality is contrary to our primary conceptions as a nation in terms of shared equality, shared prosperity. They were asking themselves as well how many of these reformers were members of an elite class, right? Educated, middle-class Americans. They were asking how they were complicit in the problems that they were seeing around them, not just pointing the finger at the idle rich or some similar thing. They also engaged in a vast foment of citizen innovation. Instead of saying, hey, you know what we really need is a national leader to come along and save us, they said to themselves, there are problems right outside my doorstep. I can begin to solve them. They did so, and then some of the solutions that they created bubbled up to the municipal level and then to the state level, and ultimately became blueprints for vast national changes that really shaped the America that we know today.
You bring up a lot of really interesting points there, not just focusing on one person. The collective effort of people working together is something that we've really lost sight of. So Bob, I'll bring you back in here. We've gone from me to we, back to me. How do we become more of a community, and how do we focus on things outside of ourselves when it feels like there's so many different distractions? And like you said, there are so many reasons to be pessimistic at this moment.
Yeah, I think there are other lessons back from that period. Again, as Shaylyn said, we're not trying to say that the content of what people did back there was the right solution, but we're saying the strategy that they used is really, we can learn a lot from that. And one that was already mentioned that will be familiar today is it's very clear that the leader back there, I mean, the top political leadership did not cause this. Charismatic leadership was not what was needed. And if you think that that's a reference to today, I won't, that is, if you think there are people around today who think that they're the charismatic leadership and they're going to solve the problem, I don't want to get political here, but there is a certain similarity between the lesson, I mean, the lesson we learned from the last time is don't wait around for a charismatic leader. That's not the way to go. A related point that Shaylyn was talking about was this process was very decentralized, very decentralized. I'm talking about then. Because the national level was so blocked politically, and the country was so polarized politically, where did you start? You started with ordinary people in ordinary towns and cities across America, not Harvard, not the West Coast, not Washington, but just ordinary people in, you know, East Elbow, Iowa. I'm making up the name of it. It was places you'd never heard of, but they were the ones who were small enough and connected enough that they said, well, you know, up in what the rest of the country can do whatever they're going to do. We're going to help our kids here, our poor kids here. And it was a stretch because that meant rich folks in the little town who had already paid for their kids to go off to, you know, to Chicago and make a lot of money. They paid for their kids to get a private education. They had to be convinced that they should also do the same thing for other kids in town who couldn't afford to go to private, you know, boarding schools or whatever. And that's where they, for the first time in the world history, they invented a public high school. I have to say that. The public high school was not invented, God knows when, any place else. It was invented in small town, middle America in around 1910. And then the idea went viral. I mean, really viral. Within 10 or 15, 20 years of that starting in one little town in you know, the central of Iowa, or yeah, Iowa it was, almost all communities in America had a high school. I mean, think about that. You went from one little place to the whole country in 10 or 20 years. Pretty amazing. That was the first real thing. It began, you know, ordinary people trying to fix the problems, and then they shared ideas. And not every good local idea turned out to be a good idea, but you could, as one of the people at the time said, our system allows people to try different things and learn which of them work. And the ones that work then got passed up. I think another point, and I may turn this back to Shaylyn, you know, one of the things that's interesting about Shaylyn and me is we come from very different parts of the country. I live in the most blue postal district in America, in Cambridge, and Shaylyn, as she will say, lives in almost the most reddest district in America. So we come from, we agree on most things, but we're coming from different perspectives, and she's much younger than I am. Actually, she's just a kid. And so, Shaylyn, in that regard, why don't you pick up and say something about the youth part of the story, that is the youth in the progressive era?
Yeah, I think that's really important. Shaylyn, jump in here just about the impact of youth here.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other clear lessons from the progressive era was how much this movement, and when we call the progressive movement a movement, you have to understand that it was not an ideological movement. It was not progressive in the sense that we would use the word today to describe sort of the left side of the political spectrum, right? This was an essentially apolitical movement that involved people of all different ideological stripes, that involved women and men and elites and factory workers and Black Americans and white Americans and all sorts of people. And one of the things that was similar about a lot of them was how young they were. I mean, many of the leaders of the progressive era were under the age of 30 when they really rose to prominence as leaders of a new era of American history. And so, and I think one of the things that really characterizes youth is an outside the box way of thinking, is an entirely innovative way of looking at problems. And you know as well as I do that we need that today more than anything. We don't need more of this left-right gridlocked, policy proposals that we just sort of fight to a stalemate, right? We need ideas that maybe transcend that gridlock and are entirely outside of the box. And I think America today already has a very robust social entrepreneurship sector in which people are doing these things. But oftentimes we're not sharing ideas enough. We're not, working together enough to make sure that things that are working locally then bubble up and get adopted on a higher level. But youth, I mean, absolutely, youth were important then, and I think will be incredibly important now. We, of course, see that with the leadership of movements against gun violence and movements against climate change and the Black Lives Matter movement. Those are led by young people. And those are the movements that changed America.
We're talking about high school age kids here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Greta Thunberg, or I've forgotten the name of the couple of kids from the Dorothy Stoneham massacre, pardon? Marjorie Stoneham massacre, kids who were in that are now leading this national anti-gun violence. That's the way it'll look. And actually, this is another aspect of our being optimistic. We are actually quite optimistic. I mean, of course, we're in a pickle as a country, but we think we're within, we can do this. And I think probably, Shaylyn, you would agree that one of the things we've learned is you can't just drift along with history, taking it where you want. You can master history. That is, people have agency, and that's the main message we want to make to young people and to everybody. Look, it doesn't have to be this way. You're not fated by, history or God knows what. People can take charge of their own lives and moreover their own history, especially if they work together. Shaylyn, you surely agree with that.
I do.
That's the power of your own agency. And I think that speaks to a lot of the different things we're mentioning here. And I think something that's really interesting is that, starting with the Gilded Age, and you mentioned this upswing, is that it's, decade by decade, things are growing when you look at the economy, when you look at socially, politically. And then we get to this point in the upswing in the 1960s and the 1970s. And that seems to be like what I'm thinking is like a simpatico time in terms of all this work has finally gotten us to here. And then we go for the downswing. So what was it about the 60s and the 70s that all of this stuff came together? Bob,
well, you're right. We talk about that in the book. We actually don't put as much emphasis on that in the book as the earlier pivot back in 1900, because from my point of view, it's an interesting social scientific question, what caused the turn up at the top. But if we want to make change, the place we can learn is not from that. We can learn from the earlier pivot. But of course, it's an interesting question, what happened in the 60s and 70s. And I think basically it's a perfect storm. America, you described it very well. America sort of went into the 60s. It's like one of these pivots that swimmers do when they're at the end of a pool. They go into a pivot, they go in one direction, and they somehow make a upside down flip, and they go out the opposite direction. And that's what happened in the 60s. We went into the 60s very much in this, upbeat period. That was when I was in college in the 60s. And we thought, we didn't think America was perfect by any means, but we thought we were going to fix America, and we were on the way. And I remember, forgive me, just a personal anecdote, I personally stood in the back of the crowd on the east front of the Capitol building in 1961, January 20th, 1961. And I, with my own ears, heard Jack Kennedy say, "Ask not what you can do for your country. Ask not what the country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." I thought he was, honestly, I thought he was speaking to me personally. Casey, I was barely an adolescent, right? So I thought, well, we're fixed for, this is going to be the future. But actually, it turned out that was not reveille for a new time. It was taps for an era that was just about to end. It's kind of sad, and trying to figure out exactly why it did end. It involves a lot of backlash against the civil rights movement. It involves, a lot of turmoil that was going on. You can see it in women's issues. You can see it in violence in the cities. You can see it in drugs. A lot of turmoil that led. Some people were happy with that, of course, but some people were so turned off by that, there was a huge backlash. And by the time we end the 60s, we come out of the 60s in what at the time Tom Wolfe called the me decade. He said, even right in the middle of it, he could see what was happening. We had been in this we decade, but whoops, now we're in a different era.
I think I'm really interested also in the issues of race and also of gender, because there's definitely so much progress that has been made, but yet at the same time, we are still reckoning with so much right now. So sure. Shaylyn, I'll bring you back in here. What did you learn from the past? Because when I'm looking at some of the graphs in here, it feels like there is just crazy exponential growth. And then other times there isn't so much growth. So when it comes to race and gender, how does the past potentially inform our present and then our future here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think one of the things that we address in the book is that the first 2/3 of the 20th century, we're presenting that as this upswing and these wee decades, right? Well, what about the fact that the backdrop to this and the foreground for, a huge number of Americans was Jim Crow, right? And that is a very real thing. It is absolutely true that the we that America was building toward in those first 2/3 of the 20th century was a highly racialized we. That was enforced quite violently, right? We don't have any sort of illusions about what that really was. But what's fascinating is when you actually look at the data, comparing Black and white material well-being over the course of the 125-year period that we examined, what is striking is that you actually see that Blacks and whites were both making progress because of something called the Great Convergence, which was happening economically at this time, but that Blacks were actually making faster progress than whites, which meant that the gap between Black and white material well-being was actually steadily narrowing over the course of the first 2/3 of the 20th century. Now, this is sort of a surprising finding, right? Because usually
we should maybe just say, just to be clear, material well-being is just taught, that's just fancy language for saying Blacks were narrowing the education gap. Blacks were narrowing the infant mortality gap. Blacks were narrowing the structures in which they were. It was not airy-fairy. It was the real lives of Black people in that period were becoming not just better, but closer and closer to whites. Go ahead, Shaylyn.
Yeah, and so I think, I don't know if you feel this way, DJ, but I think that's sort of a surprising story, because oftentimes what we hear is that, all was stagnation and oppression until these sort of lightning bolt changes of the civil rights era, which of course occurred in our 1960s period, right? And then at that point, things got better and better and better. Now that's true for certain measures, particularly measures about segregation and exclusion, legalized exclusion, things like that. But when it comes to actual income equality, actual educational equality, the rate of change was significantly better before the civil rights movement, and then actually entered a period that we call in the book the foot off the gas period. So essentially it was like America was driving toward greater and greater equality, material equality between the races, and then all of a sudden that progress stalled and in many cases reversed, which you'd think to yourself, well, how does this correspond to the story of America's I century, right? Well, what we argue in the book is really that the we decades, even though they were highly racialized and highly segregated decades, were actually more hospitable to equality of outcomes than our narcissistic me decades that we've seen since that time. And, I think that forms an important backdrop to the protests that we're seeing today in the Black Lives Matter movement, which is that, people are just fed up. It's like we had the civil rights movement that was supposedly going to make everything better. And in fact, things completely stagnated. And I think most white Americans do not realize that.
Yeah.
Most white Americans look back to the civil rights movement and say, hey, we fixed that problem. Like, what are you so upset about now, right? And it is incredibly important to emphasize that things have gotten not better, and in many cases worse for Black Americans since the 1970s. And there's an enormous amount of frustration and an enormous amount of just a feeling of being fed up that America has not made good yet on this promise of we. And I'll just add one last thing, which is that when you look at those first 2/3 of the century, the reason that Black Americans were doing better and better was not because the white establishment was creating programs to help them get ahead. It was really because Black Americans were taking their fate into their own hands. And by the millions were leaving the South for the more hospitable North, still exclusionary, but more hospitable North. And it was really this persistent effort on the part of Black Americans to claim their place within that American we, literally against all odds, that created that upward swing for them. So imagine what could happen in today's period if we were to take this moment seriously and say, what kind of upswing do we want to create today? Could we create an upswing in which we are actually cognizant of exclusion, and we create an upswing and a we that includes everyone? There's immense power in that. And I think that's the real hope of a lot of young people, and particularly the people leading the Black Lives Matter movement today. And it's our hope as well.
Yeah, I love what you just said there.
Note that there's another case in which we're optimistic. I mean, actually, you could look at all the Black Lives Matter protests and so on. You could think, oh, America's going to hell in a handbasket. We actually think that contains the seeds of great possibilities for the country.
To finally deal with that unresolved question of race.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're dealing with it now will impact the next 2, 3, 4, and 5 decades, because that's exactly what this book is looking at. It takes several decades to see all that change, and the friction that we're going through right now is going to have a positive impact in the end.
That's exactly
we hope
right.
that it will. I mean, right? I think that there's still a lot of question as to what the nation as a whole, our response will be to movements like Black Lives Matter and to movements like the movement for climate change, right? We're not necessarily currently in agreement about the fact that, oh, this is great, we're finally bringing these things to our attention and bam, we're just going to fix it all, right? I mean, I think there's still a lot of hard work to do, a lot of which has to do with this moral awakening, in my opinion. I think that we're on the very front end of a moral awakening as a nation, not on the back end going, oh, we finally realized, we've got to fix these age-old problems. And so again, back to that message of agency, right? Every single American needs to look inside themselves and say, do I believe in the promise of we? Do I believe that we are all in this together? Or do I believe that I'm in this for myself and that everything is a zero-sum competition for resources? That to me is the fundamental question that we're facing right now.
Yeah, there is just so much in this book, and I think there's so much that people can learn, and also just look in the mirror and actually face the problems going on in this country. Because based on the way you look or based on who you are, you haven't always had to do that. And there are other people who've had to do that every single day of their lives, and I think we're finally realizing that we all need to do that together, and I feel like this book is going to help with that. So, Shaylyn, Bob, I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much, and I'll see you both down the road, all right?
Great conversation.
Thank you.